This is Gemseeker, a new series that I'm starting because there's sort of a gap of things that I can cover, and this series is meant to allow me to cover more different things, because I have two main series on this channel, one of which is for games in early access that I think are worth a look, and one that is for just new, relevant things that just recently came out. And that sort of leaves me with a bit of a difficulty when it comes to missing out on certain things, or just having them pass me by entirely. There are a load of games that I would like to actually go back and take a look at that are too old to be relevant for like a brand new game series, but are still worth a look nonetheless, and that's what this series is for. The basic criteria is I have to have not covered it before in any capacity, and also it has to be at least 1 year old or more. So that kind of technically makes this like the Steam sale series, you could say, because if you've ever saw a game go on sale and been like, oh yeah, I remember when that came out a couple years ago, I wonder if it's worth it. That's what this series is for. So the first one I wanted to cover is Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr, which is quite a mouthful. This is a Diablo-style ARPG set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe where you play as an Inquisitor. And the Inquisition in 40k is very much like the Inquisition in real life, except for with like 300% more skulls and spikes. They are effectively a terrifying series of elite units that are mostly kept secret from the general population and deal with things like seeking out heresies and various demonic infestations and the like. And the first thing that makes this stand out a little bit from other ARPGs is that it incorporates some elements of like RTS. Specifically, it kind of reminds me of the Dawn of War games, fittingly enough. So there are a couple of extra mechanics and some sort of differences to the controls and all that that make it feel just a little bit different than a traditional ARPG. For instance, you can actually move with WASD, which is unusual, instead of just holding click to move, which is the general way that games like this tend to work. But I found that using WASD to move actually works pretty well in this game, and probably that's because another unusual feature, the camera is freely rotatable. So this allows you to move around in a 3D space quite effectively, just using WASD and the middle mouse button to rotate the camera. So I actually ended up using a combination of the WASD keys and the mouse to move at different angles and stuff, and it actually worked for me pretty well. You'll also notice that little semicircle in the bottom left corner, the colorful one there, that's around your health gauge, and that is the suppression mechanic. This is another thing that reminds me very heavily of Dawn of War, and the suppression gauge is effectively like a crowd control resistance, sort of. And when you're in the green, you're immune to certain crowd controlling effects. However, once you start taking fire, this gauge will start to deplete independent of your health gauge. And once it hits the yellow mark, you become vulnerable to certain slowing effects and things. And once it hits red, you become extremely slow and you get vulnerable to stuff like stuns and the like. And this encourages you to use another one of the more odd mechanics of the game, which is a cover system. Simply holding space next to cover will allow you to crouch down and actually get in cover and avoid enemy fire. It's a mechanic that makes sense in games like Dawn of War, but is a bit odd in an action RPG where that sort of thing normally isn't present. So it actually makes it kind of a cool standout feature, and it works pretty well. When you're in cover, your suppression gauge refills much faster and also depletes a lot slower. And of course, since this is 40k, you're going to be dealing with a lot of enemies with guns and other range weapons and things, so taking cover is actually important. Enemies can use cover as well, and you can even have a squad of other soldiers and things with you at times too. Some missions will actually give you other NPC units that will follow you around, and it gives the whole thing a kind of like hybrid RTS vibe to it that's actually kind of cool, because I don't know about you, but in my opinion, Warhammer 40,000 is actually at its most interesting when you're dealing with a group of people or a squad of some kind. I tend to not really enjoy the like single character lone wolf stories that tend to focus on stuff like Space Marines oftentimes, and I think it's a lot more interesting to follow a group or a squadron or something like that. So I think all these mechanics come together to sort of do the game a service and make it like a hybrid ARPG RTS that actually works with the strengths of the 40k universe, that being like squad mobility and stuff like that, and also still keeps the action RPG destroy tons of enemies with magical powers vibe that makes that sort of gameplay enjoyable, and actually creates somewhat of a hybrid that does a pretty good job. There are 4 different classes for you to choose from, as well as each one having, I believe, 3 different sort of subclasses that determine their specialties and things. So there's a good amount of character variety, and there's also a lot of equipment variety. That's one thing about 40k. There's a lot of lore-specific equipment for you to find, and it's actually all represented pretty well in this game. You can even find some Inquisition-specific stuff, like, for instance, the Inferno pistols. Inferno pistols are melta weapons. Melta weapons in 40k are kind of like 1950s sci-fi ray guns that just disintegrate everything everything in front of you, and they're actually pretty fun to use, but there's quite a bit of equipment variety for other types as well, not just ranged weapons, but also various kinds of melee weapons and more magic weapons, or in this case, psych weapons. And that's actually what I chose. I chose the Psyker because I tend to enjoy that sort of thing, and it's pretty cool that every class has very different mechanics from each other that makes them all play quite differently. For instance, as a Psyker, you get a lot of psychic powers, about 20 of them, and you can actually modify each of them with 3 different runes each to make them act differently or be more powerful or something like that, but often more costly, and you have to worry about managing your warp heat, which is sort of like a reverse MP, and that the higher it gets, the worse things get for you, but you also get more powerful. So there's a good amount of character depth and complexity when it comes to actually playing the class that you want to play, which I appreciate. And the large amount of different equipment types and things all gives a good vibe of like making the loot worth finding, right? Because there's actually fun stuff to find. And the interesting thing about the loot also is that not only does it have, your classic ARPG prefixes and suffixes and extra implicits and all that crazy stuff, but it also has skills on the weapons themselves. This is actually where most of your skills and attacks come from, is what you're equipped with. And different weapons have a different variety of skills, from, plasma pistols having their various pew-pews and charge shots and things, to your larger, like, force swords having crazy teleport attacks and all sorts of things like that. So exactly what your character is capable of at any given time is actually based on a combination of your class skills and the skills that come from your equipment, which means there's a lot of build variety going on here. Equipment is also very heavily customizable, with things like the ability to completely re-roll all the various bonuses that are on a piece of equipment, or to reforge them into stronger versions, and to even paint your individual equipment pieces with actual paints that are named after the colors that you would find in the tabletop, which is a bit of attention to detail that I really appreciate. You can actually change the various material types for your armors and weapons and things, and also their paint colors, just with some in-game currency. So that's a nice bit of customization, and it all adds to that feeling of build variety that the game has to make yourself very heavily customizable. Speaking of customization, there are also several skill trees in the game, a lot of them actually, that can further customize your character. When you first start out, you'll only have a couple of them unlocked, depending on the class you're playing. But as you complete these things called heroic deeds, which are effectively like achievements and the like, you will unlock more of these skill trees to spend your level up points on, and they specialize in different things, from certain skill trees that focus entirely around different damage types, to skill trees about ranged combat, or about melee combat, or about mobility. There are a whole bunch of them, and they unlock all sorts of different passive bonuses for your characters, as well as some extra bits that can modify your skills and things depending on the class that you have. Enemy variety is another very important thing about ARPGs. It has to be good to actually be satisfying, and they've managed to do a pretty good job of representing lots of different factions, and a lot of the different units from those factions in a very lore-friendly way. So, for instance, you'll encounter things like Eldar, which I was actually kind of surprised by. Eldar are kind of like space elves that have evolved the ability to subsist entirely off of their own farts, except for the ones that discovered BDSM and became very dangerously addicted to it, to the point where they now want every galaxy to dominate them, which we call Dark Eldar, but those aren't actually in this game that I know of. But the normal Eldar actually do show up, and a whole bunch of their units actually show up, including some ones that I wasn't expecting, like Fire Prisms, for instance, which are basically tanks. And it's clear that Neocore, the developers, are fans of 40k, because they've done a really good job of representing the factions and the units and the weapons and everything with a lot of lore accuracy. So everything kind of looks and sounds and feels like it should, and I'm really impressed by how accurate a lot of these enemy factions and things actually are. You'll also be fighting things like Chaos Demons, and actually some other more advanced units like Word Bearers actually show up, which are a form of Chaos Space Marine, actually the first Chaos Space Marines, and also various types of Rebel Guardsmen and the like. So there actually is a pretty good amount of enemy variety, from small horde enemies that appear in gigantic groups that are actually really satisfying to cut through and again remind me of stuff like Dawn of War, to your more elite enemies that sort of buff each other and actually work well together, to your big huge like dreadnoughts and stuff that you might not expect in the aforementioned Fire Prism and the like, that represent very large threats on the battlefield that you have to take care of carefully. Now, admittedly, there are some factions that I would like to see that unfortunately aren't in this game, but I still think there's a good amount of variety. For instance, I would like to, of course, see my personal favorite faction, the Necrons, which are sort of like space grandmas, but they were probably too busy complaining about humans on their lawn or something to show up in this game. And then there's also the Tau, which I find make really fun enemies to fight. Unfortunately, there are no Tau in this game. How would you best describe the Tau? They're kind of like if a bunch of like middle-aged suburbanite dads that are dangerously addicted to fantasy football became robots. I'm also actually really surprised that there aren't any orcs in this game as enemies, since they tend to be like the most common 40k enemy faction in pretty much any game except for maybe Tyranids. But yeah, there aren't any orcs that I know of, at least. Orcs in 40k are very much like orcs in most fantasy settings, except they're just so good at thinking that they can think about something hard enough to make it a reality even if it previously wasn't. But they are not good enough at thinking to realize this. Also, they're technically a fungus. But I still have to say, even though there are things missing that I would like to see, there's a good amount here, and the adherence to lore accuracy is very impressive. I mean, one of the things that I often judge 40k games by is how their bolters feel, because too many 40k games make bolters into just assault rifles or machine guns, and that just doesn't work for me, because in universe, a bolter fires like these soda can-sized explosive bullets, effectively. They're essentially like gyrojet rocket guns, and they're meant to be very silly and over-the-top and like horrendously violent. So if you make them just like basic rifles and things, that's just nowhere near as satisfying as they're actually supposed to feel. But in this game, sustained bolter fire will turn enemies into mist, and that's exactly what it should do. So I think the game does a pretty admirable job, especially from this sort of zoomed out perspective, of making satisfying combat where it actually feels really good to tear through large enemy hordes and to take apart larger, more threatening singular enemies at the same time. The structure of the game is also kind of interesting because it's very non-linear. You're given a ship right off the bat because you are an Inquisitor, so you have one, and you can warp to various sectors and planets and space stations and like derelicts and all sorts of other things and take on all the procedurally generated missions that you want. There are also actual like storyline missions to follow, so you're given pretty much free reign of this whole sector right from the beginning, and you can follow the story missions, or you can just level up and find loot and do other types of missions, and the storyline missions will always be of equal level to whatever you are at the time you start one. So you don't have to worry about over-leveling yourself and then having all the story missions be super easy or anything. They scale to your level, and there are also difficulty modes that allow you to add levels to the mission, making them harder and harder, all the way up to like the Eye of Chaos difficulty, which adds 10 levels to the mission and makes it extremely difficult if you would like to do that for some reason. And all of the other missions that you can find and do at any given time refresh like every hour, so there's always a fresh list of things for you to do, different tile sets for you to go down on, and also lots of different mission types, from assassination missions where you're trying to find and kill very powerful targets to like defense missions where you actually get various things to set up like turrets and traps and minefields, and you can actually order various detachments of Imperial Guardsmen and stuff to defend certain points and just make it into a large effort to sort of defend a certain point. It's kind of cool. And there are other missions as well. There's actually quite a lot of variety when it comes to the things you can do. It's not just go down, kill everything, and leave. So overall, I think that Inquisitor Martyr is actually a really faithful representation of 40k in ARPG form, and it does a really good job of being a satisfying game to play with enough variety to keep you coming back. I would recommend getting this one on sale, probably, because there's a lot of DLC for the game that adds new mission types and all sorts of other things like that, and it's all worth having for the most part. And if you can get the complete package on sale, it's a really good buy, actually, and it'll last you for quite a long time. So that's my look at Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor Martyr. I think it's actually worth taking a look at, and I'm glad I actually went back in order to have a look at it myself, because it's a fun ARPG that reminds me of something like Grim Dawn mixed with Dawn of War, and that's actually a pretty cool combination. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll link you below in the description to the Steam store page for this game if you want to check it out yourself, and I'll see you guys next time.